The woman at my door was holding a photograph of a basement wall, and before she even told me her name, she said, "Your father bought my house before he died." I remember staring at her through the storm door, one hand still wrapped around my coffee mug, the other resting on the latch. It was a grey Saturday morning in Richmond, the kind where the sky looks like old paper and the air smells like wet leaves. I had been grading history essays at my kitchen table when she knocked. She was in her late 60s, maybe older, with silver hair tucked under a navy rain hood and a manila envelope pressed flat against her chest. Her face was tired, but not confused. That is what frightened me first. She did not look like a scammer. She looked like a woman who had carried the truth too long and had finally found the address where it belonged. "My father has been dead for 9 years," I told her. "I know," she said softly. "That's why I came." Then she opened the envelope and showed me the photograph. It was a basement wall made of old brick and peeling plaster. Someone had scraped away a section near the floor. Underneath, written in black marker, were 3 words. "Ask Helen Ellis. My name. Good day, dear listeners. It's Mia again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Helen Ellis. I was 53 years old when this happened, and for 28 years I taught 11th grade American history at a public high school on the south side of Richmond, Virginia. I was not rich. I was not powerful. I was the kind of woman who kept receipts in labeled envelopes, bought cardigans on sale, and still used the same wooden desk my father refinished for me when I got my first teaching job. My students used to laugh because I always told them history was not just dates and wars. It was evidence. It was motive. It was who signed the paper, who burned the letter, who benefited when everyone else looked away. I did not know then how much I would need that lesson myself. My father, Raymond Ellis, had been a quiet man. He worked as a building inspector for the city for almost 30 years. He smelled faintly of sawdust, peppermint gum, and black coffee. He kept his work boots by the back door and his important papers in a metal file cabinet with a dent on the bottom drawer. When I was little, he taught me how to read a house the way some people read faces. "Walls talk," he used to say. "You just have to know where they learn to be silent." After my mother died, he became even quieter. He spent long evenings at his kitchen table with maps, old property records, and little yellow sticky notes. I assumed it was grief. People mourn in different languages. Some cry, some pray. My father researched. When he died of a stroke at 74, everything seemed simple on paper. His small house went to me. His truck was sold. His savings, modest but respectable, covered funeral costs and left a little cushion. My older half-brother, Martin, handled most of the estate because he was an attorney. Martin was not warm, but he was efficient. He wore tailored suits, spoke in careful sentences, and had the calm patience of a man used to being believed. "You don't need to worry about the probate details," he told me at the time. Dad kept things very straightforward. I wanted to believe that. Grief makes you grateful for anyone who can speak in complete sentences when your own thoughts are broken glass. So I signed where Martin told me to sign. I kept teaching. I kept mowing my father's little yard until I finally sold the house 3 years later because the silence inside it became too loud. I moved into a modest brick duplex near the school, planted lavender beside the porch, and built a life that was not dramatic but was mine. Then, 9 years after my father's funeral, a stranger named Ruth Caldwell stood on my porch with a photograph of my name hidden inside her basement wall. At first, I thought there had to be a mistake. "Maybe there's another Helen Ellis," I said. Ruth shook her head and pulled another paper from the envelope. It was a copy of a property deed. The address was on Bellwether Lane, in an older neighborhood near the river, where houses had deep porches, steep roofs, and histories no one could fully afford to repair. The buyer listed on the document was not Ruth. It was not my father either. It was a limited liability company called H.E. Preservation Holdings. I felt my throat tighten. "My initials," I said. Ruth nodded. "That's what I thought. I invited her in because my father raised me never to make an older woman stand in the rain, even if she brought impossible news. She sat at my kitchen table while I made tea. Neither of us drank. The manila envelope lay between us like a closed witness box. Ruth told me she had lived in the Bellwether house for 15 years. Her husband bought it at a foreclosure auction long before he died. It had been too much house for one widow, but she loved it. Then, about 8 months earlier, a real estate firm contacted her with an offer to buy. At first I said no, she said, but they kept coming back. Higher number every time. Cash offer. No inspection. Close in 14 days. That alone made me uneasy. I had watched enough neighborhoods change around the edges to know that cash offers were often less about homes than land. Who was the buyer? I asked. A development group, she said. At least that's what they claimed. But when my nephew looked closer, the paperwork led back to the same lawyer over and over. She looked down at her hands. Your brother. The kitchen seemed to go very still. Martin? Yes, she said. Martin Ellis. I did not speak. Teachers learn how to hold silence. In a classroom, silence can be a tool. It tells you who is prepared, who is hiding, who is about to confess. But in that moment, silence did not feel like a tool. It felt like the floor lowering beneath my chair. Ruth explained that she refused to sell after the pressure became too aggressive. Then strange things started happening. City notices about code violations she had never received before. Letters from contractors claiming her foundation was unsafe. A polite phone call from someone at a bank asking whether she understood the financial burden of staying in the property at her age. I knew something was wrong, she said. So my nephew started helping me clean out the basement. We thought maybe we could prove the foundation was sound. That's when a piece of plaster came loose. And behind it was my name. Not painted as graffiti. Not scribbled like a child's joke. Written carefully in my father's handwriting. Ask Helen Ellis. I knew my father's writing the way some people know a voice in another room. The square capital H. The long tail on the S. The stubborn downward slant when he wanted words to stay put. Ruth handed me a second photograph, closer this time. Below my name, half hidden under dust, was a number. 4719 3B. As a history teacher, I spent my life telling teenagers that documents do not answer questions. They teach you which questions matter. That number mattered. I copied it onto the yellow legal pad I kept beside my essays. Then I asked Ruth for copies of everything she had brought. She watched me label each page in order, date the top, and write her name, phone number, and address in the margin. You're very organized, she said. I grade research papers, I answered. I've seen what happens when people don't cite their sources. She gave me a small smile, but her eyes were wet. Before she left, she hesitated at the door. I almost didn't come, she said. Your brother told me you were unstable after your father died. He said contacting you would be cruel. That was the first time I felt fear sharpen into something colder. Martin and I were not close, but I had never thought of him as cruel. Distant, yes. Ambitious, certainly. He had built a respected probate and real estate practice. He served on boards. He sponsored charity luncheons. He sent Christmas cards with embossed lettering and no personal message. But there is a particular kind of danger in polite people who know how paperwork can bury a body without ever touching it. After Ruth drove away, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. My students' essays were still stacked beside my laptop. One of them had written about Reconstruction, about how freedom on paper does not always mean freedom in life. I stared at the sentence until the words blurred. My phone rang at 2:17 that afternoon. Martin. I did not answer. He left no voicemail. 5 minutes later, a text appeared. Helen, I heard a confused woman may have contacted you. Please do not engage. There are legal issues you don't understand. I read it twice. Then I took a screenshot. I was not brave. I was careful. That night, I did what I always advised my students to do when a source seemed suspicious. I built a timeline. On the left side of my legal pad, I wrote dates. On the right side, events. Father died, April 12, 2017. Probate opened, May 2017. Estate closed, January 2018. House sold, September 2020. Ruth first contacted by buyers, 8 months ago. Basement wall discovered, last week. Then I added smaller things I had ignored for years. Martin discouraging me from going through Dad's old file cabinet. Martin saying some papers were too technical and would only upset me. A bank envelope that arrived at my duplex 2 years after Dad died, addressed to HE Preservation Holdings. I had assumed it was junk mail because I did not recognize the company. I remembered tossing it into a drawer. I got up so fast my chair scraped the floor. In the hallway closet, I kept a plastic bin of old mail, warranties, school documents, and things I always meant to sort during summer break. It took 40 minutes to find the envelope. It was from Commonwealth Heritage Bank. The paper inside was a notice about an inactive business account. The balance was not large, $426.18, but at the bottom of the page was a line that made my hands go cold. Authorized signer, Helen M. Ellis. I had never opened that account. I had never signed for that company, and someone had used my name. The next morning was Sunday. I did not call Martin. I did not call Ruth. I did not call the bank. I made coffee, ate one piece of toast I could barely swallow, and went through every box of my father's papers I still had. Teachers know the difference between searching and panicking. Searching has method, panicking only makes a mess. I divided everything into piles. Property, banking, medical, personal letters, unknown. In the bottom of a shoebox filled with old inspection badges, I found a folded map of Bellwether Lane. My father had circled Ruth's house in red pencil. Beside it, he had written the same number from the basement wall. 47 to 19 3B. Under that was another note. Helen must see wall before sale. My father had died before telling me, or someone had made sure he never got the chance. By Monday morning, I was at school before sunrise. I taught 3 classes that day on the progressive era, trust-busting, and the difference between reform and revenge. I remember standing in front of 27 teenagers, explaining how corruption rarely begins with a villain laughing in a dark room. More often, it begins with respectable men convincing themselves rules are obstacles meant for smaller people. My own voice sounded strange to me. During lunch, I called a lawyer. Not Martin, not anyone connected to him. I called Evelyn Park, a former student's mother who had become a civil litigation attorney. Years earlier, her daughter had struggled in my class after a family crisis, and I had given her extra time without making her feel ashamed. Evelyn never forgot that. When I told her only the simplest version, she went quiet. "Do not confront your brother," she said. I wasn't planning to. Good. Do not sign anything. Do not give anyone original documents. Scan everything. Save texts. Write down dates and conversations. And Helen? Yes? Assume he already knows more than you do. That sentence followed me home like a second shadow. I spent the next week doing homework of my own. Every night after school, I scanned documents at my kitchen table. I created folders on a flash drive and cloud storage. I labeled each file with dates, sources, and descriptions. There was comfort in the order, a calm line drawn through chaos. Evelyn ran a corporate records search and called me 2 days later. HE Preservation Holdings was formed in 2014, she said. Organizer listed as Raymond Ellis. My father? Yes, but the registered agent was changed in 2017, 3 weeks after his death. To who? There was a pause. Martin. I closed my eyes. Evelyn continued. And Helen, there were property transfers connected to this company. Not many, but enough to matter. 3 old houses, all in neighborhoods where your father had conducted inspections years earlier. Why would Dad create a company in my initials? That's what we need to find out. Then she asked me a question that seemed simple. Did your father ever mention unsafe renovations, hidden rooms, or historical preservation? I almost laughed. My father mentioned hidden rooms the way other fathers mentioned football. There had been rumors in Richmond for decades about old houses near the river, underground storage spaces, prohibition tunnels, Civil War hiding places. Some were real, most were exaggerated. My father had loved separating myth from structure. He used to say, "A house doesn't keep secrets because it wants to. People teach it how." The next clue came from the county records office. I took a personal day, something I almost never did, and drove downtown with a notebook and Ruth's copies in a folder. The clerk behind the counter was young, patient, and overworked. When I gave her the parcel number, she pulled archived permits and old inspection notes. There it was again. 47193B. Not a random number. An inspection reference. The file was from 1998. My father had inspected Ruth's house after a water line repair. The report was routine until the last page. Possible concealed structural cavity behind south basement wall. Recommend preservation review before alteration. Attached were 2 photographs. One showed the same basement wall before it had been covered with plaster. The other showed a faint outline of a bricked-in doorway. I felt the room tilt. My father had known something was behind that wall. But why buy the house through a company in my initials? Why not tell me? Why hide a message for Ruth, or for me, behind plaster? The clerk lowered her voice. You may want to request the supplemental file. What supplemental file? She glanced toward the back office. Older inspection records sometimes have field notes. They're not digitized. It took an hour. When she returned, she brought a thin folder tied with string. Inside was my father's handwriting. The notes were brief, technical, and careful. South wall likely non-load-bearing concealment. Interior air gap detected. Property may contain sealed room. Owner deceased before review. Then, on the last page, written in darker ink, do not alert ME conflict risk. ME, Martin Ellis. For a moment, I could hear nothing but the fluorescent lights overhead. That was when I understood the shape of the lesson changing. This was no longer about a strange house or a hidden wall. This was about my father knowing Martin could not be trusted. I took certified copies of everything. That afternoon, as I walked to my car, a black sedan was parked across the street. A man in a grey suit stood beside it, pretending to check his phone. When I looked at him, he looked away too slowly. Fear is strange. It does not always make you small. Sometimes it makes every detail brighter. I noted the license plate. Then I drove straight to Evelyn's office. Evelyn Park's office was not dramatic. No mahogany walls, no city view, no leather chairs meant to intimidate. It was a narrow suite above a pharmacy with framed diplomas, a tired ficus plant, and a conference table covered in organized files. I trusted it immediately. She listened without interrupting as I laid out the county records, the map, the bank notice, Ruth's photographs, and Martin's text message. When I finished, she leaned back. I'm bringing in a forensic accountant, she said. Is that necessary? Yes. That was all she said, and somehow that frightened me more than if she had given a speech. The accountant's name was Daniel Reyes. He was a soft-spoken man with silver glasses and the patient expression of someone who found truth in numbers other people hoped were too boring to read. He requested bank records, corporate filings, probate documents, and any signature samples I had from the years around my father's death. 3 days later, Martin called again. This time I answered with Evelyn sitting beside me, and my phone on speaker. Helen, Martin said warmly, as if we spoke every week. I'm worried about you. That was his first move. Concern. I'm fine, I said. I heard you've been digging through old property files. You may not realize how complicated these matters are. I'm learning. A small pause. That woman who came to your house is attempting to exploit you. She is elderly, frightened, and possibly being influenced by relatives. I would hate to see you dragged into litigation you can't afford. I looked at Evelyn. She wrote one word on her notepad. Pressure. I appreciate your concern, I said. Martin sighed, not loudly, just enough to sound disappointed. You always were sentimental about Dad, but he was not the saint you imagined. He had questionable dealings near the end. I protected you from that. There it was, the second move. Rewrite the dead man because he could not defend himself. What dealings? I asked. I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. Then put it in writing. The silence changed. Helen, don't make this adversarial. I'm not making anything. I'm asking questions. His voice cooled by 1 degree. Questions can become expensive. Evelyn underlined pressure twice. I thanked him for calling and hung up before my hands started shaking. Then Evelyn said, That was useful. Useful, he threatened me. Politely, and now we know he's nervous. Daniel's first report arrived the following week. It was 26 pages, and I read it the way I read a student essay that began with confidence and collapsed under its own missing evidence. The signatures creating HE Preservation Holdings did appear to be my father's, but 3 later documents, including one that changed control of the company after his death, contained signatures that Daniel flagged as materially inconsistent with mine. Mine. Someone had signed my name as consent manager. I stared at the scanned page. Helen M. Ellis, written in a version of my signature that looked like a bad performance. Too large, too decorative. The H looped in a way I never looped it. I felt insulted before I felt afraid. There is something intimate about forgery. It is not only theft, it is someone climbing into your name and walking around wearing it. Daniel had also found a bank account linked to HE Preservation Holdings. Over 9 years, money had moved through it in strange patterns: small maintenance payments, legal fees, transfers to shell vendors, and, 3 months before Ruth was first pressured to sell, a large deposit from a development company connected to one of Martin's clients. How large? I asked Evelyn. $2.4 million. I set the report down. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then Daniel said, that may have been an option payment. For Ruth's house? Possibly for a bundle of properties, but this one seems central. Why? He turned a page. Because of an appraisal. The appraisal valued Ruth's property at far more than any normal house on Bellwether Lane. Not because of the structure. Because of subsurface historic access and redevelopment potential. Evelyn looked at me. Do you know what that means? I thought of my father's old stories. Sealed rooms, tunnels, foundations with past lives. It means the basement wall matters. Ruth agreed to let Evelyn inspect the house with an independent structural engineer and a preservation specialist. I went with them on a cold Thursday afternoon, my stomach tight the whole drive. The Bellwether house was pale yellow with white columns and a sagging porch swing. Inside it smelled of lemon oil, old wood, and rain. Ruth moved carefully through the rooms, touching door frames as if apologizing to the house for bringing strangers. The basement stairs were narrow and steep. My father would have hated them. No handrail on the lower section, uneven tread. He would have written it up in red ink. At the bottom, Ruth switched on a bare bulb. The south wall stood ahead of us, patched and scarred where plaster had been removed. My name was still visible. Ask Helen Ellis. Seeing it in person was different. The photograph had been strange. The wall was devastating. I reached out but did not touch it. Dad, I whispered, though I had not meant to speak. The engineer used a small camera through an existing crack. The preservation specialist watched the monitor. There's a cavity, she said. Ruth gripped the railing. How big? Evelyn asked. Bigger than a closet. The engineer adjusted the probe. The image on the monitor flickered through dust and darkness. Brick, wood, a rusted hinge. Then something pale appeared. A metal box. Not a safe, not exactly, more like an old document chest. The room went silent. Evelyn immediately raised a hand. No one opens anything today. Ruth looked frightened. Why not? Because now we preserve chain of custody. That phrase felt strange in a basement, but I understood it. Evidence is only as strong as the care used to protect it. I had told students that for years. A primary source pulled from context becomes vulnerable to every liar in the room. Evelyn filed an emergency petition the next morning to prevent sale, demolition, alteration, or transfer of the Bellwether property pending investigation. She also sent preservation notices to Martin, the development company, the bank, and every entity Daniel had connected to the transactions. By noon, Martin was at my school. He did not come into my classroom. He waited near the main office, wearing a charcoal coat and the expression of a man attending a professional luncheon. My assistant principal, who did not know the story, looked impressed. Helen, Martin said, may we speak privately? I could feel students watching from the hallway. Teachers live public lives in small ways. We cannot even receive bad news without someone noticing. We can speak with my attorney present, I said. His smile remained, but his eyes changed. I'm your brother. Then you should want me protected. He lowered his voice. You have no idea what Dad did. You think you're defending him, but you may expose things that damage everyone. Then send the documents to Evelyn. Helen. He said my name like a warning wrapped in velvet. I stepped closer, just enough that he could hear me without the secretary hearing. I teach teenagers for a living, Martin. I know when someone avoids the assignment. For the first time, he looked truly angry. Not loud, not dramatic, just a thin crack in the polished surface. You always did think moral certainty was the same as intelligence, he said. No, I answered. I think evidence is better than both. I walked back to my classroom with my knees shaking. That evening, I found a letter taped inside my screen door. No envelope, no signature. Let the house go. Your father already chose who to trust. I photographed it in place, called Evelyn, and then called the police non-emergency line. The officer who came was polite, but not especially hopeful. Could be hard to trace, he said. I know, I replied, but I'd like the report number. Documentation is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just refusing to let intimidation disappear unrecorded. The petition hearing happened 2 weeks later in probate court because the matter touched my father's estate, corporate control, and possible forged consent documents. I had never been inside that courtroom before. It was smaller than I expected. No sweeping staircase, no dramatic music, just wooden benches, fluorescent lights, lawyers with rolling bags, and people waiting for decisions that might change their lives. Martin arrived with 2 attorneys from a larger firm. He looked calm. Ruth sat beside me, twisting a tissue in her hands. Evelyn placed a folder in front of me and whispered, "Let the evidence do the work." The judge reviewed the emergency motion. Martin's attorney argued that Ruth was being misled, that I had no legitimate claim, that my father's old company had been dormant and irrelevant, and that delaying the sale would cause financial harm to multiple parties. Evelyn stood and spoke plainly. Your Honor, we have credible evidence of forged documents, undisclosed property interests, coercive purchase attempts against an elderly homeowner, and a concealed structural space containing materials directly linked to the deceased, Raymond Ellis. Martin's attorney objected to nearly every phrase. The judge allowed enough. Then Evelyn presented the photograph of the basement wall. Ask Helen Ellis. For the first time in 9 years, my father's handwriting entered a courtroom. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Ellis, she said, looking at Martin, were you aware of this writing? Martin rose slowly. No, Your Honor. His voice was perfect. Were you aware of any concealed room in the property? No. Were you aware your father had inspection notes concerning this wall? A pause, barely visible. No, Your Honor. I wrote the pause down. Teachers notice pauses. Students pause before they lie, before they remember, and before they decide which truth costs less. The judge granted the preservation order. No sale, no demolition, no alteration, full document production, limited forensic access to the concealed space under supervision. Outside the courtroom, Martin approached me. Ruth moved closer to Evelyn. Martin ignored her. This has gone far enough, he said quietly. I agree, I said. You're being used. By whom? He looked almost sad. By people who want money Dad never intended you to have. That sentence stayed with me, because it assumed the conclusion. Not that there was no money, not that the documents were fake, only that my father did not intend it for me. A week later, the wall was opened under court-approved supervision. The basement smelled of brick dust and cold earth. A videographer recorded everything. The engineer removed the loose section carefully, brick by brick, while Evelyn, Ruth, Daniel, the preservation specialist, and a court-appointed observer watched. Behind the wall was a narrow room, maybe 8 feet by 12. The air that came out felt stale and mineral-heavy, like a sealed jar opened after decades. Inside were shelves, 2 rotted wooden chairs, and the metal document chest we had seen on the camera. There was also a painted sign leaning against the back wall. Caldwell and Ellis Survey Office. Ruth gasped. My husband's grandfather was a Caldwell, she whispered. Evelyn looked at me. Ellis. My father's family name. The chest was removed, photographed, and opened by a locksmith in the presence of everyone. Inside were oilcloth packets, old survey maps, property ledgers, bonds, letters, and a smaller sealed envelope with my father's handwriting. For Helen, when the wall is opened. I did not open it there. I wanted to. Every part of me wanted to tear into it and hear my father speak, but Evelyn touched my arm. Not until it's logged. So I waited. That night was the hardest. I sat at my kitchen table with a copy of the envelope in front of me and the original locked in Evelyn's evidence cabinet. Rain tapped against the window. My father's old desk lamp made a circle of yellow light on the wood. I thought about how many times he had sat at his own table, trying to decide what to tell me. I wondered if he had been afraid of Martin. I wondered if he had been ashamed. I wondered whether he had meant to protect me, or whether he had underestimated how fast death can interrupt a plan. The truth has a weight of its own, but waiting for it has weight too. 2 days later, in Evelyn's office, I read my father's letter. Helen, if you are reading this, the wall survived long enough for the right person to ask the right question. I am sorry. I should have told you sooner, but I was trying to confirm the records before involving you. This house is part of an old land trust created by our ancestor, Thomas Ellis, and Ruth Caldwell's ancestor, Samuel Caldwell. The trust was meant to protect several properties and underground access points from being sold during a time when ownership records were manipulated against families who could not defend themselves. Over the years, pieces were lost, stolen, or absorbed into private hands. I found evidence Martin learned of the trust value through my files. He wanted to force sales before the records were corrected. I created HE Preservation Holdings in your initials because I trusted your patience, not because I wanted to burden you. If I failed to explain it, forgive me. If Martin is involved, trust documents before family. There was more. Names, dates, instructions. A warning that certain deeds had been altered. A note that the Bellwether property might unlock claims to several accounts reserved for preservation and restitution. Not treasure in the childish sense. A legal inheritance tangled in history, property, fraud, and greed. I cried then, quietly. Not because of the money. I still did not even understand the money. I cried because my father had known me. He had trusted the part of me other people found boring. The patient part, the note-taking part. The woman who would rather be accurate than impressive. Daniel's expanded audit uncovered the rest. Martin had found my father's research years before Dad died. At first he helped. Then he realized the trust assets, if consolidated and sold to developers, could be worth millions. He began positioning himself through legal filings, shell entities, and quiet influence over elderly owners. After my father died, Martin used forged consents under my name to gain practical control of HE Preservation Holdings while keeping me unaware. The $2.4 million was only the beginning. There were option contracts, consulting fees, escrow transfers, and promised future payouts. The Bellwether house mattered because the hidden room contained original trust ledgers proving that several properties had never been lawfully separated from preservation restrictions. Without those ledgers, Martin could argue the restrictions were unenforceable. With them, his development deal was poisoned. That was the first mistake he made. He thought old paper was weak. But old paper, kept dry and witnessed properly, can outlive every polished lie. Depositions began in early spring. If you have never sat through a deposition, it is less dramatic than people imagine and more exhausting than they know. A conference room, a court reporter, bottled water, lawyers objecting in calm voices. Questions repeated until the truth either appears or the liar has to build a second lie to support the first. Martin was deposed for 6 hours. I watched from the far end of the table. He wore a navy suit and a pale blue tie. He answered slowly, politely, professionally. At first he sounded convincing. No, he did not recall seeing that specific inspection note. No, he was not aware of any forged signatures. Yes, he had acted in what he believed were the best interests of all parties. No, he had never pressured Ruth Caldwell. Then Evelyn began placing documents in front of him. Email from Martin to developer, elderly owner resistant but vulnerable to code pressure. Invoice from Shell consultant paid through trust-linked funds. Draft consent form bearing my forged signature, attached to an email from Martin's office before the date it was supposedly signed. Phone log showing Martin called Ruth's bank contact 3 hours before Ruth received the financial burden call. Each document was a brick removed from his wall. At hour 4, Evelyn placed my father's field note in front of him. Do not alert ME conflict risk. Mr. Ellis, she said. Who is ME? Martin looked at the paper. I don't know. Could it refer to you? I suppose. Why would your father identify you as a conflict risk in a file concerning the Bellwether Lane property? His attorney objected. Martin still had to answer. I can't speculate about my father's state of mind. Evelyn nodded and placed another document down. It was an email Martin had sent to himself from my father's old office scanner 2 weeks after Dad died. Attached was the same field note. The room went completely still. Evelyn's voice did not change. Does this refresh your recollection? Martin stared at the email. For the first time he looked older than me. I don't recall sending that, he said. The court reporter typed every word. The collapse did not come with shouting. It came through accumulation. That is how truth often wins. Not as thunder, as weight. By summer, the civil case had expanded. The bank cooperated after receiving subpoenas. The development company tried to distance itself from Martin. Ruth gave a deposition that made everyone in the room quiet. She did not dramatize anything. She simply described the phone calls, the letters, the fear of losing her home, and the moment she saw my name on the wall. Then my turn came. Martin's attorney tried to paint me as emotional, resentful, and financially motivated. Ms. Ellis, isn't it true you were disappointed by the modest size of your father's estate? No, I said. Isn't it true you believed your brother received more respect from your father? No. Isn't it true that after learning these properties might have value, you pursued this claim aggressively? I looked at the attorney, then at Martin. I pursued documents, I said. The documents revealed the aggression. Evelyn's face did not move, but I saw her pen pause. She liked that answer. The turning point came when Daniel testified in a preliminary evidentiary hearing. He walked the judge through the money trail with the patience of a teacher, explaining long division to a student who insisted the answer was whatever helped him pass. Transfer by transfer, signature by signature, entity by entity. At one point, the judge stopped him. Mr. Reyes, are you saying funds connected to a company created in Ms. Ellis's name were used to finance efforts to acquire property from Ms. Caldwell without Ms. Ellis's knowledge? Yes, Your Honor. And signatures attributed to Ms. Ellis authorize some of that control? Yes. Do you believe those signatures are genuine? No, Your Honor. Martin sat very still. The judge referred portions of the matter to the Commonwealth's attorney and ordered an independent administrator over the trust assets pending final resolution. Martin was suspended from managing any related property entities. His firm placed him on leave. The bank froze connected accounts. But the most satisfying moment was not public. It happened in Evelyn's conference room 2 weeks later. Martin requested a private settlement meeting. Evelyn advised me to attend but say little. Ruth came too, with her nephew. Martin arrived with counsel, looking thinner but still polished. His attorney made the offer. A confidential settlement. Ruth would sell under improved terms. I would receive a reasonable distribution. All parties would avoid further reputational harm. When he said reputational harm, he looked at me as if my reputation and Martin's were somehow equally at risk. Evelyn asked, "Does your offer include admission of forged documents?" No. Does it restore Ms. Caldwell's full ownership rights without pressure? The attorney hesitated. It compensates her. Ruth spoke then, her voice soft but steady. I did not ask to be compensated for being frightened out of my home. I ask not to be frightened. Martin looked away. Then he turned to me. Helen, please. Dad would not want this. For 9 years, I had missed my father so badly that even hearing someone misuse him hurt. But grief had changed by then. It was no longer an open wound. It had become a witness. I opened my folder and took out a copy of Dad's letter. My father wrote, "Trust documents before family." Martin's face tightened. I placed the letter on the table. "So that is what I'm doing." We did not accept the offer. The final resolution took almost another year. Legal endings are rarely clean. They come in filings, amended orders, negotiated admissions, sealed exhibits, unsealed findings, and checks that arrive long after the emotional climax has passed. But justice did come. The court confirmed that HE Preservation Holdings had been created by my father for preservation and trust recovery purposes, with me as intended successor manager. The forged documents were invalidated. The Bellwether House was protected under a preservation agreement, and Ruth retained ownership with a funded repair grant drawn from recovered trust assets. She did not have to sell. Several properties were removed from pending development deals until title and trust restrictions could be properly reviewed. The bank account connected to the scheme was placed under court supervision. Funds improperly transferred through shell entities were partially recovered. I received a lawful inheritance from my father's preservation trust, though not the wild fortune people imagine when they hear words like hidden room and millions. It was enough to pay off my mortgage, retire earlier than planned, help Ruth restore her porch and foundation, and create a small scholarship for students who wanted to study public history, preservation, or law. Martin lost his license to practice law after disciplinary proceedings. Later, he pleaded to financial crimes connected to forged documents and misuse of client-related entities. He did not go away forever, as some people might expect in a movie. Real justice is often less theatrical, but he lost the thing he had used as a weapon: credibility. And sometimes that is the truest consequence. People ask whether I forgave him. I do not answer quickly. Forgiveness is not a door people get to demand because they are tired of standing outside. I stopped letting Martin live in my daily thoughts. I stopped replaying every conversation, wondering when the lie began. I stopped measuring my father's love against my brother's betrayal. But I did not pretend nothing happened. Peace is not the same as denial. I stayed in my brick duplex for another year. Then I bought a small cottage outside the city with a deep backyard and enough sunlight for tomatoes. Not a mansion, not a place meant to impress anyone, just a home with good bones, a wide kitchen window, and a porch where I could hear birds in the morning. I kept teaching until the end of that school year. On my last day, my students brought me flowers, handwritten notes, and one terrible store-bought cake with blue icing that stained everyone's teeth. I cried in front of them, which I had promised myself I would not do. In my final lesson, I wrote 3 words on the board: evidence, patience, courage. Then I told them, courage does not always look like a raised voice. Sometimes it looks like saving a receipt, asking one more question, waiting to respond until you understand the game being played around you. Sometimes courage is not dramatic at all. Sometimes courage is a woman at her kitchen table with a legal pad, deciding that confusion will not be the place where she stops. Ruth and I became friends in the slow way older women do, without needing to announce it. I helped her choose paint colors for the restored porch. She taught me how to make peach preserves. Every few weeks we sat in her kitchen and talked about our fathers, our husbands, the strange mercy of being believed late rather than never. The hidden room beneath her house was eventually stabilized and documented by preservation historians. They found more ledgers, old survey tools, letters, and evidence of families who had protected one another through laws that were not designed to protect them. My father had not been chasing treasure. He had been trying to finish an unfinished correction. That mattered to me. It meant the inheritance was never just money. It was responsibility. I used part of my share to fund student visits to archives and courthouses. You would be surprised how differently young people understand history when they see a deed book larger than a Bible, or a signature that changed someone's life, or a courthouse basement where records sit quietly waiting for someone patient enough to ask. Sometimes I still think about that first morning, Ruth on my porch, rain on her coat, the photograph trembling slightly in her hand. Ask Helen Ellis. My father knew I was not the loudest person in the family. He knew I was not the richest, not the most connected, not the one people would fear in a boardroom. But he also knew I could follow a trail. He knew I respected paper. He knew I believed truth was not weak just because it was old. For a long time, I thought my ordinary life made me easy to overlook. Now I understand something different. Ordinary women keep records. Ordinary women remember dates. Ordinary women notice when the story changes. Ordinary women can sit quietly in courtrooms, kitchens, banks, and offices, while powerful people underestimate them. And when the time comes, ordinary women can open walls. So if you are listening to this, and someone has made you feel foolish for asking questions, I want you to remember this. Confusion can be manufactured. Guilt can be assigned by people who benefit from your silence. Politeness can be used as a mask. And family, when it is corrupted by greed, can become a language of pressure instead of love. Do not let anyone rush you past your own instincts. Write things down. Keep copies. Ask for documents. Call someone qualified. And never assume that a calm voice is telling the truth simply because it does not shake. I did not become free because I found money behind a wall. I became free because I finally trusted the careful part of myself. That was the real inheritance my father left me. And now I want to ask you, dear listeners, what would you have done if a stranger came to your door with your name hidden inside her basement wall? Would you have called your family first, gone to a lawyer, or walked away out of fear? Tell me in the comments. And if this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe, because somewhere out there, another woman may need to hear that the truth still has a way of finding the right door.